If you are the owner or a leader of a $3, $4, $5 million marketing agency, and what used to feel easy now feels really hard, and the wheels are falling off, and tensions are rising, and clients are churning, and you don't know what's going on, I've got good news for you. One, you're in good company. This is a very common problem. Number two, we have the playbook to help you solve this problem. My name is Ryan Watson. I'm partner at Upsourced. We provide accounting operations and CFO advisory for 7 and 8 figure marketing agencies. We see this problem a lot. In fact, we have seen it so often, and I have personally lived through it, such that we have created a playbook for agency owners to help solve this problem. We call it the Grow Mode Playbook, where we delve in detail the inflection point that agencies undergo as they're exceeding the $3-4 million revenue mark and growing into the $5-6 million revenue mark. We talk about the challenges that they're facing, and we outline in explicit detail the operating model required to overcome this inflection point and continue to scale. In the Grow Mode Playbook, we have 3 parts, 3 key steps. In this video, I want to talk about the first step. First step, shrink the organization. So first of all, a common impulse when agency owners are getting to this point where things used to be going really well. They had a $2 or $3 million agency, and it was sustainable, and it felt repeatable, and they were making a profit. And then all of a sudden, they get a little bit bigger, and everything's really hard, right? And the work is no longer repetitious, and they're making mistakes. And again, clients are not feeling taken care of, and the consistency of their work is failing. The natural impulse is to create more process and create more bureaucracy, and to sort of better legislate how work is done. And while I'm not going to suggest that having process is a bad thing, and it may be a component part to what the solution needs to be for your specific agency, but it is not the whole answer, right? It's actually the wrong intuition, because the reality is we as agency owners, we do not create, we're not building widgets on a factory assembly line, right? We don't churn out a homogeneous set of products day in and day out. Agencies are, by their very definition, a creative pursuit, and they require nuance, and they require flexibility, and they require us to understand the individual problem that our client is facing and meet them where they are and tailor a solution. And that problem requires us, quite frankly, to have the same amount of flexibility and nimbleness that we had when we were a little bit smaller. And that is the answer. That is step 1. That is shrink the organization. We need to go back to the composition of the business that we had back when we were $2 million in revenue and this thing was working, right? We got to capture that magic. Now, how do we do that? Well, I'm not suggesting we fire half of our clients and just take our revenue from 4 or 5 million back down to 2 million. I'm not suggesting that. But what we need to do is we need to shrink the organization, or divide the organization into component parts, such that each component part looks and feels like that old agency of yours that was small enough to manage in this nimble way, right? So the point is, at this inflection point that you're experiencing, the business is now too complicated, too big, too complex to manage as a monolith. You can't do that anymore. You now need to manage it in its component parts, such that the goals of the component parts and the performance of the component parts ladder up to the org-wide goals, right? So how do we do this, right? How do we shrink the organization? Well, the first step we got to do is determine what are those component parts. How are we going to take our business and divide it up into these manageable pieces that we can optimize individually? There are a couple options here. Basically, there are 2 options. One option is departments, right? So if you have a marketing agency and you go to market with specific service lines, let's say those lines are SEO and paid media and content or whatever, and customers are buying these individual service lines, and your team is organized along these individual service lines, well, that is a very natural way for you to segment your organization, and that is likely how you should divide up. Not every agency works that way, though. Some agencies offer maybe just like one thing. It looks a little bit more uniform across the organization, and so there aren't these like natural service lines. In that world, the better way to divide up the organization is in what I call portfolios or pods, collections of clients or teams that service a collection of clients. And so if you have 30 clients and they're all getting roughly the same kind of service, you can divide them into, for example, 3 teams of 10. The point there is it doesn't really matter so much how you divide the organization, so long as you have a rational way of doing it and you make that choice. Okay, so first step is divide them into their component parts. Okay, now, how do we manage these component parts? Well, the first step into managing these component parts is appointing deputies. So this is the point, and again, what is often true about the agency that has hit this inflection point and is feeling this tension is that it is too large for the centralized leadership team to try to bear hug all these decisions. What is often true is that this leadership team is now several layers removed from the decisions that need to be made. And quite frankly, they're a bottleneck. The old process is a bottleneck to getting work done. And so now we need another layer of leadership, these deputies, right? So we've got to elevate the next level of leadership. Ideally speaking, they're coming from internally, but in some cases you may have to hire externally. But the point is I'm appointing deputies who are going to manage each one of these component parts, departments or portfolios in such a way that they ladder up to the aims and goals of the organization at large. Okay, so I appointed deputies. Now, how do I get the most out of my deputies? Okay, well, I love talking in numbers. I love talking in threes. 3 ways to get the most out of my deputies. Those ways are set goals, hold them accountable, align their incentives. I'll hit that again. Set goals for your deputies, hold them accountable to hitting those goals, and align their incentives to those goals. All right, let's talk about each of one of those. First, set goals. Listen, this should be pretty straightforward. I think most organizations, when they appoint deputies, they get this part sort of right, mostly right. The premise here is, obviously, as an organization, we have a vision, we have values, we have things that are important to us, we have goals. We need to set goals for our deputies, for those individual component parts, in a way that ladder up to the goals that matter. So, for instance, if I, as an organization, have an org-wide goal that is 50% gross margin, right? Here's a quantitative measure, and we're targeting a 50% gross margin, and that's important to us. Well, then each division should be incentivized to support that margin goal. They should each have a goal that ladders up to that 50% gross margin goal. Here's where things can fall off the tracks, though. If I am so like a natural impulse would be to say, all right, well, our gross margin is 50%. So you know what? Every one of these departments, you have a goal, and that is to earn a gross margin of 50%. Maybe that's appropriate, and maybe it's not. The important question to ask is, am I giving them the autonomy? Am I giving them the autonomy to pull the levers necessary to earn a gross margin of 50%? Can they control all the inputs to that goal? So for instance, can they hire employees at their discretion? Can they make termination decisions unilaterally? Do they have influence or a voice in pricing decisions or budget approval conversations for new clients in the door? If the answer to those questions are not a uniform yes across the board, then it is highly likely that giving them a gross margin target is going to be a very frustrating experience for them because they cannot influence all the component parts of that gross margin, and they're going to get frustrated and potentially leave or at least underperform, right? So the most important thing you need to consider is, for every one of my deputies' goals, do they have the autonomy to drive that result? And by the way, if I am not willing to give my deputies, and there's plenty of reasons why I would or wouldn't, but if I'm not willing to give my deputy carte blanche, for instance, to hire and fire, but I do want them to somehow support the margin goal, then what I'm more likely to do is give them, for instance, a project margin target so that they influence the profitability of the work that they're doing and not a gross margin target. In other words, I'm not going to hold them accountable for utilization because they don't have the levers to influence utilization, but I am going to hold them accountable to how profitable we are when we are actually doing work. So that's an example of saying, just making very certain that if you're giving somebody a goal, they can influence those things. So anyway, number one, set goals. Number two, hold them accountable to those goals. This is often where folks who are going through this exercise will fall off the rails. What the most common mistake we see is agencies saying, you know what, we need these departments. And obviously departments need leaders, and obviously leaders need goals. And so they do 1, 2, and 3, and then that's it. Everybody leaves, and then 3 months go by and 6 months go by, and nobody's ever talked about these goals ever again. And so now they just become this kind of shadow thing that we talked about once, but turns out it's not that important. If we want our leaders to be, for their behavior to be influenced by these goals, we've got to hold them accountable to them. Our preferred method of creating accountability for these goals is a mechanism we call the MBR, or the monthly business review. And basically the way this works is all of these leaders, they have specific goals. Once a month, we get together in a room, physical or virtual, and we talk about them. We say, okay, Sally, your goals were X, Y, and Z. How did they go? And the thing to keep in mind is we don't want this to be a browbeating session. We don't want this to be punitive. It can't feel like they're going to some firing squad. It's got to be productive, right? The whole point is for us to say, okay, if things went well, what happened that we can learn from? If Sally is having success here, what about Sue? Can she learn from the success of Sally that she can apply to her own pod, right? And if things aren't going well, let's talk as a group about why we think we didn't achieve our goal and what we can do differently next month to achieve a different result. And again, Sally can learn from Sue and whomever else, and this beautiful thing happens where collaboration takes place and leaders can learn from one another. And so while it's not directly punitive and we're not directly going to browbeat one another, we are going to leave the meeting and say, okay, this didn't work. We're going to try that, and we'll come back together in a month. And the wonderful thing that's going to happen is that all of these deputies are going to be aware of that meeting. And they know in 1 month's time, they are going to sit in front of their peers who they're going to feel a little bit competitive with, regardless of how you facilitate that. And I can promise you, they are not going to want to explain in front of their leaders and peers why they didn't achieve their goals. They are going to want to explain the wonderful successes they had. This is going to be seriously motivating without you having to add any extra emphasis to it. So that's topic number 2, right? We set goals. We hold them accountable to those goals. The third piece is we align their incentives, right? So if the accountability step, the monthly business review, is a version of a stick, even though we don't want it to be explicitly a stick, the incentive is definitely the carrot, right? And when we say incentive, generally speaking, what we're talking about is incentive compensation, right? We want the paycheck they receive to be influenced in part by their performance against the things that we've all said are important, right? Now listen, there are a million ways for us to create an incentive compensation program for employees at your organization. And I'm not gonna go through all of those ways. But what I do wanna do is give you a few guiding principles. Let me rephrase. I'm gonna give you one guiding principle. And that guiding principle is keep it simple. When cause and effect are clear, for example, when I do this, I get that, behavior changes. We understand what that means, right? Pavlov's dog, right? Behavioral conditioning. When the cause and effect are clear, then our behavior changes. But when the cause and effect are vague and maybe not clear, like, okay, well, when I do X in this way, I might get 50% of Y, but then if I do 75% of Y, I'll get 60% of Z. Like if there's this really convoluted, everybody, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. If you've created this, what you believe to be clever and overly comprehensive program that sort of encompasses all the potential permutations and things you might want to hold them accountable to and you might think are important, but it just becomes, I've got 7 different metrics and 4 different ways I can perform against those. Anyways, you get the point. That is not going to motivate behavior. You cannot mentally, if you can't do the quick mental, relationship between the input I just did and the output I'm going to get. If you don't know, if I do this, I get this amount of money, it's over. At that point, you sort of give up, you throw your hands in the air, and you're just like, well, I guess I'll figure it out at the end of the quarter, because who the hell can keep track of what's actually happening here? So regardless of what metrics you select, keep it simple. And by the way, you can have more goals than you have incentive compensation levers, right? Just because you might give a deputy, let's say, 5 goals for their department does not mean that all 5 of those goals need to directly influence their incentives. The other thing I'll tell you is, this is now a preference thing. Whatever you select, let's say you make it project margin. This is just an idea. You make it project margin. You make it CSAT results, whatever it is. I like to say, okay, you get X compensation based on this target. This is my expectation, and this is my expected compensation for you if you reach that expectation. You have the opportunity to get some, but not all. So you did, let's say a B job, or a B minus job, but you still get a little bit. So maybe you got 80% of the target, you get 60% of the compensation or something like it. And then you also have the opportunity to do an A+ job and get even more than your target compensation, right? So I like to give folks the opportunity to outperform and a little bit underperform and still make some incentive compensation. But beyond those 2 things, keep it simple. Give them some, give them a range. I think you have a lot of flexibility on how you do this, right? But overall, this idea of going back and capturing the magic that you had in your previous, what we called build mode, as you're going through this inflection point and going to grow mode, this is the single biggest unlock. And I will admit to you, as a fellow founder, entrepreneur, leader, this won't feel natural, because basically all of the success that your organization has experienced to this point has come from the brute force that you and your partners and your early employees have thrown at this organization, right? That's the nature of starting a business, that against all odds, you have just willed the thing into existence and to where it is today. But once you hit grow mode, that whole relationship, that whole dynamic flips. And your ability to be successful in the next stage is inversely related to your individual effort and directly related to the environment that you've created, the goals, the accountability, the incentives that you've created for others to do their work without you. And to be successful, that means shrinking the organization, being explicitly clear on who the deputies are, what they own, what their goals are, how you're going to hold them accountable, how often you're going to talk about it, and what their results are, incentive compensation, when those things happen. Like I said, it's not going to feel natural. It's not going to be easy. But when you do it, as I said, it will be the single greatest unlock in the history of your organization.